authority running for all of our contracts. But these rules are part of our constitutional framework, and they dictate how procurements must be ran within the council. They came to Audit Committee about 2 years ago for a sort of quite a major overhaul. They were brought back last year with some minor amendments, and they've come back this year with some amendments again, largely to just reflect current legislation and the new corporate strategy. So I'll just run through the proposed changes. So one of the changes we've made is we've included a clause on the Modern Slavery Act. So the Modern Slavery Act imposes certain obligations on sort of commercial entities, and while we are actually outside of the scope of the number of those obligations, it seemed right that we sort of adopt those, the spirit of those obligations. So there's an emphasis on any officers who are procuring to ensure that they are taking the relevant steps to make sure that we sort of eradicate any modern slavery that might be happening within our supply chains. The focus is on supply chain, because that's where, particularly us as a local authority, that's where we're most likely to encounter acts of modern slavery, so construction supply chains in particular. So we do have a certain pre-qualification for certain value contracts that is aimed at filtering out any suppliers who may have any history of engagement with modern slavery, as well as we quiz suppliers on what they do proactively to ensure that there's no modern slavery within their supply chains.
Council, question? John? I'm sort of surprised that we're not in scope, but I thought the government would have made all of its, okay, we're not part of central government, but that would have made local government subject to that.
Yeah, so at the moment the emphasis is on what they call commercial organisations, which have a turnover, I think, in excess of 35 million, and the idea is that they're trying to target organisations that are most likely to be engaging, so particularly for manufacturing and construction and others. I believe they are also currently looking at the modern slavery to put more obligations on local authorities. At the moment, a number of local authorities sort of participate with this anyway, but there's no formal requirement. But my understanding is that is currently being reviewed, and even if there isn't at this point in time, there will be obligations on authorities to take certain steps.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. I struggle to understand how you have any grip on the nature of contractors or subcontractors' activities as far as modern slavery is concerned from sitting here. I mean, how on earth could you be in a position to make any... It's not a criticism of you, it's a question that I'm simply asking openly. It's a burden you're clearly happy to take on voluntarily at this stage.
Yeah.
How on earth could we as a council be in a position to make judgments about the practices of contractors or subcontractors that we could rely upon? Secondly, do you have any comment to make on the financial cost of any extra administrative burden to be borne as a result of doing what is proposed here?
Yep, so I think that's a very valid question. How can we as officers sat at our desk in the Berries and Godalming be aware of what's going on in our supply chain? And I think ultimately we can't say with 100% certainty at all, but what we can do is, when we are, particularly for our large value construction contracts, I'll pick them as a good example, we can quiz the suppliers that are bidding for our contracts to see what are they doing to be proactive. We do have to take them at their word for it, short of going to sites around the country.
But it's an assurance to the council that would satisfy the requirement as we see it at the moment. Is that right?
Maybe I wouldn't use the word insurance. Insurance makes it sound like we're just covering our back. I'd like to think that we're asking the question sort of for a valid reason, and we want to see that people are proactively sort of doing something to, you know, it is difficult to preempt what that something is, but by asking the question, if nothing else, we're saying that this is an important matter for us as an authority.
Well, that was the first bit of the question. I'll ask another one before I ask you to comment on the cost side of things. Is there a proposal to put into any contracts with third parties the obligation to abide by the terms of the Modern Slavery Act or whatever? I mean, I know in the corporate world that's an increasingly common requirement that a supplying party will have to confirm as a matter of contractual obligation that they are, which again, you know, puts the onus, if you like, on them to prove that they are, or at least be able to demonstrate that they're doing the right thing.
So that's not in scope of what we're doing here, but I don't see why it's not something that we wouldn't include in our contracts going forward. And
that seems to me quite an effective, you know, that's actually gives it some contractual
absolutely.
strength.
It's meaningless having all these policies if our contracts are going to be silent on the.
And as I say, it's becoming a fairly well-worn path in the corporate world.
Yeah, with regards to cost, you were
the extra cost of the administrative burden that the council will have to undertake as part of its due diligence in the matter.
I suppose with regards to extra administrative cost, a lot of these authorities who are bidding for our contracts are already having to do on an annual basis report on what they are actively doing to discourage, seek out modern slavery. So it would just be for us when we're evaluating our tender returns, it would just be another item, another question for us to evaluate in terms of officer time. That's relatively small.
Okay, that's a good answer. Thank you.
Chairman, could I sort of liken it to things like health and safety and equalities, where we would often ask for policies and evaluate those policies. Now, again, I think there's a realism about, you know, we don't police our supply chain organisations 24/7. So, but at the point of entering into a contract, we try to check that they are have policies and that they can convince us on large contracts, you know, through interviews and things that they follow them and they believe in them. And I think of any doubts. And I think the modern slavery sort of added onto the list of legislation that's relevant to us, and hence Patrick putting it into our procedure rules, and partly around raising awareness at our end as well, actually, that it is an issue, and we need to think about its importance. But it's a really tricky one to ensure that contractor doesn't undertake any of these practices. We can only do what we can in terms of our due diligence. And the point.
I mean, corporately we have the sort of serious organised crime group, so they work. Waverley officers working quite close with sort of Surrey Police, fire and rescue, and there's been quite a lot of work onto modern slavery, sort of by that group. So it seems only right to sort of expand that to the rest of what we do as a council.
And there's no physical evidence you could look to support what the contractors claim are.
No, a lot of with a lot of current procurement legislation, a lot of it is down to self-certification. So there is an element of we have to take them at their word. However, if we can find that what they've said to us is not the case, then that's misrepresentation, and we could exclude a bidder for that.
Okay, thank you.
Just one question. If this is written into the contracts from now on, then they would be in breach of contract if they were found to be in breach of the law.
Yes, that's what we'd be saying.
And we would then take that forward, I would imagine.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, any more questions on this item?
Okay, the next is there's some sort of legislation with regards to tax and tax implications. So what we've done is just inserted these items in, so more to bring them to officers' awareness. I think these are a lot of things that sort of people aren't necessarily, nor would they have any reason to be aware of. The first is CIS. So CIS is a scheme brought in by HMRC to reduce tax evasion within the construction industry. So this is just trying to flag to officers that there are certain sort of steps that they have to take and we have to take when we're paying contractors for building works. IR35.
Sorry, before you leave.
That's quite right.
Is there a limit value on that? Is over a certain amount that would be appropriate, or is it to all contracts?
Any construction. But, the next one is IR35. So IR35 is relates to essentially off payroll working. So this is where we have people who are employees in all but name. So this was brought in to make sure that it doesn't happen. Basically, at the moment we don't have a policy at Waverley on IR35. So what we're trying to do here in the CPRs is just establish a clear position. What we're saying is if it's in scope of IR35, it is an employment matter, so it's dealt with by our HR team, and if it's outside the scope of IR35, then it should be treated as any other contract. By that we mean it should be tendered, we should be putting it through a competitive process. The intention is to avoid situations where you have sort of people being employed through personal service companies, and that's just the sort of arrangement that we're trying to avoid.
The government bought this one in Chairman mainly because the BBC and the NHS were doing a lot of this. Yeah.
That's highlighted the sort of problems.
But they are rolling it out to the private sector from next year, and so that'll be quite interesting, because it's been in the public sector for 3 years now, because I think the government are basically saying that there's a lot of this off payroll, people working for themselves, and tax evasion in the public sector. So we'll clamp down on that first, because they'll get our own house in order, and then we'll roll it out to the private sector. So it's quite a big deal. And
is that going to apply to the plumber you get to fix your home systems?
Plumbers are probably all right, because they're you know, it tends to be in the professional services actually that this happens.
If you've got a plumber come back to your house every day to fix the plumbing, then he's likely to be an employee rather than a contractor. But if he's going around to lots of other places, then he's working for himself.
He's probably a rubbish plumber as well.
So, can I ask, do we have many contractors working here?
No, so we do have some agency staff. So I'll take Chris Berry as an example. So our interim head of planning at the moment. So our requirement when we employ through an agency is to make sure they are within IR35. In other words, the agency that we contract with to bring professional service individuals in are deducting national insurance and PAYE from the individual, and we get an undertaking to that effect. So that would be called inside IR35. If an agency, if we went to an agency and said, look, we need a interim strategic director for 6 months, and they said, okay, well, we've got this person here, it's outside of IR35 because they're working for Annie Wright and Associate, and you'll be paying that company, we'll say, can't do that. They either come through you within IR35 and you arrange to deduct the tax, or we can't go there. So we do have a few agency staff that are okay, and we also do buy in, so not into a post, but we buy in professional services from small companies, sometimes ones that are individuals with a certain specialism. That's fine as long as we procure it through the procurement rules, and we don't try and sort of dress it up as a employment. And so we're the right side of it. In fact, only in this room this morning we sort of updated all of our senior managers on IR35 to make sure that they do abide by the rules. So having this in the contract procedure rules will help all of our spending officers to be aware and avoid any of the risks.
So, Chairman, I'm thinking at a slower pace than everybody else. Can I just hop back very quickly to CIS? Later in the session this evening, we were going to look at the audit progress report, and in that there's currently an internal audit review of CIS, which one imagines may throw up some issues which may lead to recommendations to address that in the May procurement rules. So can I just sort of flag that's happening and suggest that before you go to press, maybe it might be worth having a line of sight to that document to see whether it's worth adding one or two more minor adjustments. Hopefully not.
Yes, I'll have a chat with Gail.
Thank you.
The next one is with regards to reverse charge of VAT. So this is applicable where we are constructing something, but we are not the end user. So needless to say, that is not something that happens often. It's not something I can envisage happening. But I suppose maybe if we were building something on behalf of or for one parish, maybe, then it's just a reverse charge mechanism for the VAT. We're simply putting it in here to make sure that people are aware of it.
Okay.
Next one is just quickly on the accessibility standards. So there's a new public sector accessibility standards. So wherever we are producing web content or a supplier on our behalf is producing a website which displays our information, it just has to meet certain accessibility standards. Simply paragraph in the CPRs, just to make it clear to people that there is an obligation on us of that. Next, I've just included a section to reflect the corporate strategy on carbon neutrality. I've had some comments on this I don't want to discuss, but basically it's just emphasising that all officers procuring must make consideration of sort of our target of being carbon neutral. So asking them to minimise in the first instance, but if not offset carbon impact where applicable, with a focus on renewable energy or low carbon technologies. But I didn't know.
Yeah. Can I?
Please, Richard.
Yeah, okay, so it's great to see this appearing. I, in my former professional career, had quite a lot of involvement in trying to get contractors to drive down their greenhouse gas emissions with some success, and I think we could be going quite a lot further here. Now, this is a statement of high level intent, but procurement of services is actually a very powerful way of driving contractors to give cleaner services if we make that an important issue. I think we're stepping into the realms of policy if this committee actually specified what might be done, but I think it might be worth recommending that possibly the Environment ONS give some thought to where additional clauses can be put in. The kind of thing I'm thinking about is requiring all our more material contracts or invitations to tender to request tendering parties specify what they are doing towards the climate agenda, and maybe in places, if we're legally allowed to do it, and that's where Patrick's superior knowledge on the whole process comes in, but if we're allowed to do it, there may be an option to actually specify that we will not take the lowest price if someone comes in with a demonstrable opportunity to have a significant impact on our carbon footprint.
You make it a material consideration in
Yeah,
bid assessment.
yeah.
We've set ourselves a target. It's a very difficult target. This is actually somewhere where we've got some muscle to, as part of the community leadership aspect, if you like. So it's not only reducing our impacts, but it's actually driving the contracting industry in the right direction.
Yeah, so all of our procurements have a cost quality weighting when we evaluate them, so it can easily be built in as part of the quality assessment.
So what I would suggest is that, as I say, it's not our role to try and set out policy here, but we recommend that possibly Environment ONS look at this and see if there's something that can be inserted to give it more strength to help us achieve that objective. If our colleagues have a
There is a climate change advisory board. I'm sitting on that, and I think that is where that needs to go, actually.
Okay.
Because really, when you look at the wording of this, it is quite generalised. It says environmental impact must be considered. Now, in there somewhere is what we ask you to consider, what we think is the things that you should be looking at, and I think that should come from above.
So, Chairman, you could strengthen this, just listening to the conversation, and go a bit further and say that the environmental impact must be considered as part of the evaluation of tenders and given appropriate weighting, or something like that, so that it takes us a stage further. I'm looking at Patrick, he's not kicking me under the table, because what you're saying is it should be a material consideration in the evaluation, and the components of the quality side of the evaluation are entirely for the council to decide what's important.
We need to have a protocol for it, and I think that is what we should be working on.
Sure. Okay, that's good.
I think the problem with this, though, is it's an open-ended problem in the sense of how far down the line you take, if like the carbon footprint in what the supply needs to take into account.
Yeah.
It's a big area, a big issue. When you talk about offsetting the carbon impact, what does offsetting mean in this context?
I hate to use example, but it's the only one I can think of at this point in time. But people always cite planting trees as a offset. Obviously, there's more things you can do than that, but that's an example of offsetting. Of course, the best thing obviously is to, instead of offsetting it, is to reduce it in the first instance. Should always be the preference.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those issues that I know if people do this as a mitigation of the carbon footprint they're producing, energy suppliers, people like Scottish Power do this, to say they're green, but in fact they're just planting lots of trees and doing other things. I'm not sure whether, from my point of view, that the offset should figure in here directly, because I think we should be tackling the minimisation of the carbon footprint directly. And we can plant trees, of course, but I don't think that doesn't change what we're doing to move towards a carbon neutral situation.
Yeah,
not in a direct way.
I think the offsetting has been included as an acknowledgement that there will be certain things that can only be minimised to a degree, and there will always be that sort of outstanding carbon amount, and the offsetting is to try and address what we're doing. One that we talk about a lot is obviously leisure centres. We can do a lot to minimise the carbon footprint of a leisure centre, but at the end of the day, if it's got a pool, it's going to be hugely sort of have a huge impact, and that's where I think offsetting can play a role.
Are you suggesting there that the supplier of whatever pays for the trees to be planted, or is there an additional cost involved in doing any of this offsetting approach? Is it part of it, the tender bid will say, we're going to be carbon friendly, and this involves planting 1,000 trees somewhere?
So I think yes, the answer is yes. I mean,
so far where we've had this included in our tender, so we've already had it. It was included in the waste contract and the grounds maintenance contract. The emphasis on use of electric vehicles and tools. The emphasis has always been on minimising. So we've yet to actually have offsetting feature in any of our contracts. But yeah, it could definitely be the case.
Okay.
I'll just say that I think carbon offsetting was something that has a very murky past. And I do not believe we should have that in there. I think minimise covers it. Carbon offsetting, they were actually selling it, weren't they? Carbon futures and all the rest of it. And finding that nothing was happening.
I think, yeah.
I mean, if we're going to plant trees, that's great. But I don't think we should add that to our contractors. I think we should do it ourselves.
I tend to agree with you. That's, yeah.
I think, Chairman, it would be, as we grapple corporately with this new focus, actually, and the new corporate commitment, I think the group that Councillor Wilson just referred to, councillors, it would be really good, actually, if we could discuss the whole offset issue and either sort of eliminate it or define it, because I think that will help shape a whole number of policies and approaches and decisions, actually, that come through the framework. So I think that would be a good sort of term or concept to explore a bit, so that Waverley can agree amongst itself what it means by it and how much weight it will give to offsetting in a number of scenarios.
Would that be something undertaken in the environmental group? Do you think that would be
Probably the group Councillor Wilson you just referred to, the Climate Change Action Group. Is that that's done, isn't
And
it?
it's meeting next 14th or 17th of December, so you know, it's and January, so it's a bit.
Yeah.
In fact, any expert input to that on carbon offsetting would be welcome, I think, because it's not something a lot of people know about.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. The next one is an amendment. So currently our CPRs require officers to seek a number of quotes. What we are looking to do is change the wording from saying that quotes must be sought to saying that quotes must be obtained. This is just an attempt to sort of strengthen up the process a bit more and make sure that we don't have any situations where 3 quotes are being sought, 1 is being received, and that is then being sort of considered as demonstrating value for money. So we just want to make sure that officers are actually getting competitive quotes for our requirements, and we can demonstrate that it provides value for money.
You sure? I'm one of the problems we find. I'm on Hazelwood Town Council as well, and one of the problems we find is getting people to quote. You know, the town council operates under different brackets of financial banding, if you like, than laid out here clearly. But one of the problems we find is getting 3 quotes quite often, or at least, you know, we'll show 3 people a project or something, and one of them will come back with a price, and you know, by a process of asking around and our own evaluation, you know, if these are the only options and we want the job done, then we'll take the price. It's your job, if you like. But what I suspect we don't want to be in a position is if we can't do something because we haven't ticked the necessary 3 quotes received boxes. At the moment, as I understand it, it's sort of within your discretion the difference between sought and obtained. And my question is really, do you really want that in?
Yes and no. So like the town council, we also struggle for certain opportunities obtaining multiple quotes for our requirements. So that absolutely is a case, and I think it probably more can be put in. At the same time, it can be the lack of responses we get can be down to the fact that if we're only ever engaging the same couple of suppliers again and again, the message we're giving to the market is that actually there's sort of, you know, no point going for Waverley's work because it just goes to the same people. So the idea of obtaining the 3 quotes is really to drive that competitive process and to encourage more bids. We have
Well, by seeking them, you're encouraging the process, but you can't. You can take the horse to water, but you can't make it send you a quote back. Can you?
Yes, yeah, it's an
Mangling
absolute,
the,
it's an
mangling the
absolutely,
metaphor.
it's an absolutely valid point. You're right. I think it something needs to be tweaked with it. The logic behind it is that if I'm an officer, I can go out to the same 3 suppliers every time. I know that supplier 1 and supplier 2 are far too busy to quote for my work, but supplier 3 will always quote for my work. But as far as the CPRs are concerned, I've complied. So it's that sort of behaviour that we're attempting to address with this. I don't know if for the lower value ones we have sort of exceptions to it where there can be sign off for fewer quotes obtained from either the head of service or from myself. So I don't know if we want to expand that for all the bands. The only one that isn't covered as it stands is for anything valued from 25,000 to 99,999. Currently the proposed wording says 3 quotes obtained, so I'm happy to attach an override, yeah.
I'm happy with what you're happy with, because you're the fellow who's been instructed presumably to go out and get a certain job done, and you're going to be the one who's having to deal with the rules that you are now writing yourself, which seem to be binding you more than was previously the case. And that goes, I just said, are you happy with that?
If it means a bit more, a few more emails coming in for me needing to sign things off, I'm happy for that to happen, as opposed to not.
Chairman, I think it's a really good challenge actually, and a healthy discussion, because getting the balance between avoiding lazy procurement and that we don't know about because it's happening out there, and not grinding our spending to a halt is really important. Which is why we do have sort of overrides. So either on the low value ones, it's Patrick's. I think what's missing in 19.7 for the slightly larger ones is perhaps an approval from Peter or I, who would be removed from the procurement process. Would probably address that, because we can be quite challenging. And if somebody came to us and said, "Look, I've really tried, and I've got these 2 quotes, I just couldn't get a 3rd one from there," and we're convinced of that, well, we could sign that off and enable that to continue. So I really welcome the tightening,
Yeah.
but I think we don't want to grind our spending to a halt just because we couldn't get a 3rd one in. And but we want to get that discipline going with our spending officers and make them come to us and say, "I couldn't get that 3rd one. Are you happy with my process and the 2 quotes we got?" So.
Yeah,
Maybe that's the way.
a bit like the 90.8 with the if you don't get 4, you're happy to deal with 3. You could have 3 and 2 on the section 19.7. Is that in your experience generally? You do find it difficult to get sufficient bids? Is that
It depends what we're procuring. For construction, particularly low value construction, it's very difficult because at face value each job is very low value, not really worth their attention. So particularly for low value construction works, we do struggle a lot as an authority, as do almost all authorities in the area.
So, Chairman, not only, I think Graham's suggestion is good that senior officers are allowed to do the override, but could you not add in a few examples of where the override is legitimate? I can think of one that's going on in housing at the moment, for instance, where there is, I think, one nationally accepted supplier doing a piece of work for us, and it was basically a choice of one. So, it would have been ludicrous to go out to 3.
Yeah, so we do have already within the exemptions, we have a section which is waivers, exemptions and joint procurements,
which just reference it.
Which I'll just refer back to.
I think one of them is lack of credible competition actually. So it's a specialist field. So I think a reference back to that would be quite helpful actually, because that would give us a guide when a spending officer comes to us, and if we think they just haven't tried, well, we'll send them off to try again. And if they come and say, "Look, I have tried, there are only 2 people that do this in this area, then we might be persuaded.
So if I may ask, Chairman, Graham, you'll add in, or Patrick, you'll add in the officers who are capable of signing off difficult contracts over 100,000.
25 to 100 actually, and well,
Right.
this is only where they can't meet the 3 requirements.
I was certainly thinking it's necessary over 100,000, but
So
25,000 is getting a little bit
So
marginal.
there is another option for it's either or. We're saying 3 quotes must be sought and obtained, or you conduct an open tender. So if I conduct an open tender which is open to the entire market and I only get a single quote back, we're saying that's acceptable. What's not acceptable is if I'm going directly to 3 suppliers. The rationale is you will only do that if you're confident that each one of those will then respond to you.
Is there more work doing the open tender compared to choosing your suppliers? So don't you want to broader?
Yes. So there is.
Right.
An open tender is labour intensive because you could end up with 20, 30 responses, which clearly all require evaluating. So I would encourage officers to approach suppliers that they know directly, but there are some markets where we don't know what the market is, we don't know who the suppliers are out there, so that's where an open tender works best for us.
Another thing that occurred, you're talking about construction. I'm not sure that it gets written into any of this, but are there circumstances under which you would go to an external cost consultant for an opinion as to whether a series of quotes were acceptable? I mean, it's not unknown, for example, for building contractors, demolition contractors to ring a contract. They know each other. I mean, I've been there, and you end up having to do the most of them. Anyway. That an independent cost consultant would give you an opinion as to whether a particular project was in the ballpark, for example, rather than outrageously overpriced, which is what can happen, as I say, in the murky world of construction, which I know little about.
Yes, and for most of our, for all of our major schemes, a particular point to Oxford Ridge is probably the most obvious example. We have the professional technical services who will cost out the schemes prior to us tendering.
So you'll go in with a QS estimate of the ballpark figure that you'd hope to come back in on. Presumably that's part of the appraisal process.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. There was just a quick amendment to the, I won't go through it, but there's an amendment to the disposal of council assets. It previously made reference to asset advisory groups and other such things which are redundant. So it was just removing those.
No, sorry. Me again. The 26.1, this section refers to disposal that are subject to market conditions. Everything's subject to disposal of market conditions. I don't know really what that means. In 26.5 or 26.6 and below, or 26.7, I think it says, which is other council assets other than land and buildings. Items remain for disposal to be sold at the highest possible price. So, if that chair becomes redundant, then it has to be sold by the council at the highest possible price. I can't see any equivalent reference point for the disposal of land and buildings. I would expect to see something in there that land and buildings will be sold at the best open market price reasonably achievable, or something like that. Maybe I've misunderstood, or maybe there's another set of circumstances or rules that apply to the disposal of assets, land and buildings.
There's actually legislation surrounding, specifically around local authority disposals, and that's where you need a best consideration section 123 report to support your valuation when you dispose of, when a local authority disposes of land or buildings actually. So that kicks in, and anything above £2 million you have to have a full best consideration report, and if you want to sell for anything less than that you need Secretary of State approval. lower than that, there are circumstances in the legislation where you can accept less than best consideration if it's a regeneration, affordable housing in certain circumstances. So I'm not sure whether we should cross-reference that. If that
It would seem to me to make more sense, and the idea of subject to market conditions, if you mean this section refers to disposal that are at market value or whatever, or are disposed of in accordance with section 123,
I think that's
then
probably
that
the best
would be
way.
that would be a great clarification
Yes.
of what's there at the moment.
Because I mean, it's been around for years, the legislation, and it's tried and tested in numerous cases up and down the land, and the term is best consideration because it doesn't necessarily mean the highest price. Actually, it's all things taken into account, but that's bound into the legislation itself, that term, and has been tested. So we probably need to make reference to that, Patrick, in here, don't we?
I think that would make sense. Thank you. Okay, does that complete that section?
Yes, sorry. Yeah.
Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you very much.
So Chairman, should we just make those changes and run those past you and the Deputy Chairman? Just those changes that we agreed. Yeah. Between us, we'll draft some wording on whatever paragraph it was, just around the override on the wherever I'm sure Emma Slaughton. Is that okay?
That's absolutely
Good.
fine.
Thank you very
Okay.
much.
Thanks very much.
Okay, so, sorry, for recommendation. I guess this is subject to those changes, that we recommend to the council that the proposed amendments to the contract procurement rules be approved. Agreed. Thank you. Agenda item 7, financial regulations update. Peter's going to be
Yes, Chairman, I'll talk to this. So alongside the CPRs, we do a review of the financial rates. We kind of keep it on the constant review, really, because it's really important that the financial regulations underpin current business and the way we choose to run the council, to the members and the officers. So it's a really important part of our governance, but it also needs to be a set of rules that allow us to be quite efficient in how we manage business and not hold up service delivery. So there's been three key changes being proposed this time around in this update. And the first one's a carry forward of budget. So at the moment that goes to executive for approval at year end. So we drop the accounts to the end of March. We don't normally get to executive until probably June or July for any form of carry forwards, which means that if we're depending on approval to spend, it potentially can delay progress on some projects that are ongoing. It's not that conducive really to the way we operate, because we run the business every day. It's not that practical to be holding back on spend. So we've identified that, and it's become more of a it's become a bit more transparent in the last couple of years in terms of how we want to be a lot more effective in service delivery. But we need to be addressing this issue. So the proposal on the budget going forward is to go to the 151 officer to approve, and the underlying logic of that is that these are not new budget approvals, as in this is not requesting new spend. This is carrying forward existing budget approval from the prior year, effectively. So whatever was proposed to carry forward in 18-19 was already approved in the 18-19 budget. It's just about moving the budget forward into the next financial year if something's crossing the year end in terms of service delivery. And that's predominantly where the majority of budget approvals arise from, especially on things like capital projects. There are one or two capital projects ultimately that don't necessarily start in the financial year they were approved for quite a number of reasons, really. There's potentially some big numbers there, things like to Frensham, where there's a hold-up, which is getting the right approvals from external bodies to be able to progress. So we see those items being carried forward because they're still valid projects until the point that they no longer are. So that's the first, and maybe you want to discuss that before we go on to the next one. Anyone's got any questions?
This committee would be aware of the need for it anyway, I would presume.
The audit committee?
Yeah.
No, the budget carry forwards tend to go to the executive under the current regulations. So they wouldn't come to the audit committee.
Yeah, but if there was
you get
any
the final accounts.
if there was any serious problem, surely we would know about it.
Yeah, certainly. If there's problems, you
Yeah.
would, yes. But these carry forwards are not about problems; they're actually about just normal business.
So,
Sorry,
no comment? Yeah. So I think it's great aiming for the improved efficiency that this will bring about in the majority of cases. Going back a few years, not very many years, Value for Money Overview and Scrutiny carried out quite a big piece of work looking at the efficiency of capital spend, because we had quite a bad track record of carrying over quite large amounts of money from year to year, and it's obviously not good for any business to be tying up money and not using it. So I wonder whether there's a sort of middle ground here where this approvals should be permitted for material, the less material items, and for small percentages, but where there's actually a major misalignment between what was planned and what's being delivered, that could go to executive, so that executive are still keeping a good eye on what's going on. Because if we're just reporting sort of after the event, the executive's not getting the opportunity to exert any leverage on the way we're doing the business.
How we define that threshold?
That's probably a value for money. Again, that's policy rather than, I'm just querying whether this is the right thing to do. It's probably something value for money I'd look
I
at.
suppose, Chairman, coming out of a review that Councillor Seaborn's talking about, the capital review, we significantly tightened up our process, our governance of the capital programme in year. So where we are identifying through the monitoring that there are some projects are adrift, the commitment now through the process is to actually flag that up to the executive within the monthly monitoring and surrender money to either identify new capital projects to come into play that didn't make the list in the first place, or to just put the money back into the pot for spending at a later date. So there are other governance controls around the capital programme, which is predominantly where the big overspend items come from, just by the very nature of the capital programme, the size of the projects that sit in there. The revenue side of it is pretty much par for course in terms of its service delivery, and the size of the budget carry forwards there are not particularly significant. So, as Councillor Seaborn says, it does tend to be capital where we get the bigger numbers carried forward. But the governance process should be making a difference to us. Yeah, that's certainly something value for money will be monitoring going forward.
Do you want to suggest some changes to this?
No, I think Peter's right. This tightening up has gone on. I haven't been party to seeing what's happening, but if we've got assurance from officers that it's actually happening, then it certainly makes for a much more efficient business. I don't dispute that.
Chairman, it might be something where the governance really could be around the Value for Money Committee actually looking at the capital programme periodically to understand the delivery, rather than locking down the process and also the permissions.
Okay. Well, I know that I talked to the portfolio holder, Mark Mayweather. He's happy to go along with this change.
Okay.
Yes, I think, Chairman, Peter and I met with Councillor Merriweather as well, and he he said he had discussed it with you, and he said we can sort of feed in his comments this evening. And one was actually not dissimilar to Councillor Seaborn's around the sort of transparency of the what's happening on the ground with our delivery of our projects. And I think we felt that ONS, particularly value for money ONS, could sort of hold the executive to account and officers to account by periodically taking a look, having a sort of focused look at the spend against budget on the capital programme. Say at somewhere in Q3, for example, maybe the November meeting when there's been quite a lot of activity, and you'll know at that point whether anything's going to blow off course. Because we do that as officers, but I think that would open up the transparency with the OVM scrutiny committees, and that's Councillor Merriweather was happy with that, and hopefully that sort of addresses the same point. And I think if we find that we've got something fundamentally wrong with our ability to deliver capital programmes, I would expect the ONS committee to raise an alarm bell. And if any of that was to do with the governance around it, then I'm sure the audit committee would want to have a look too. But it would probably just be because things have been delayed, or there have been budgeting that wasn't realistic in the first place. But hopefully, as Peter said, with the work of the ONS previously, we've drilled most of that out of the system now. But there is still an issue on housing new build that we need to keep a close eye on, and I'm sure your committee will. Councillor Seaborn.
Okay, so go on to the next one. So the next change is the approval of fees and charges. So, the council, as you will find this week, those attending the financial sessions, we're going through a very challenging 4-year period where we need to be very agile in the way we take our services forward. And a big part of that is our ability to change our fees and charges structures more commercially and respond to markets where necessary. And that's not every single service in the council, because when you look at the structure of our fees and charges, there's quite a big swathe of our fees and charges are set by central government or external bodies, so we don't really get a big say, such as planning fees, for instance. But the areas where we can be more commercial, we need to be a lot more agile. And the current process is that we take fees and charges to full council once a year along the budget, and then if we want to make adjustments in year, we have to go back to council to make those adjustments, which it doesn't really help us bring in new technologies for things like car parking charges or other areas like Careline, where we want to just do a bit more product differentiation in what we're offering and be able to charge appropriately for that without constantly having to go back to council. So we've proposed here to go literally from the scale where we're saying everything's gone to full council to totally the other way, saying actually we delegate that to the Section 151 officer. It's not necessarily going to pass through council that easily, because there's things like the car parking charges will be challenging ultimately to get an agreement on that. But these are things that we can put some caveats in to make sure that there's some check and balance, whether it's an increase within a set range, or whether it goes to the executive for approval, because there are however many executives a year. Fees and car parking charges we don't need to be that agile with compared to other services that we charge. So it's just open to a bit of debate on that as to what to do.
I don't want to expose too much in the way of ignorance, but is this a proposal that the Section 151 officer approves changes to fees and charges that are handed down by others, or autonomously can decide fees and charges?
It's okay. It would never be autonomous. It would always be working with the service, the relevant service, and also be working with portfolio holders, because they're never out of the loop when it comes to what's going on in the service. So there's that consultation that would happen, but ultimately the decision would be to the 151 to make. in terms of what that fee and charge would be, as opposed to going to council and asking council to ratify something that's actually just really just normal course of business. And if we were behaving in a business-like way, we wouldn't be going to the board of directors to set prices all the time. It's a management decision based on lots of different factors such as market and competition, and these are things we have to consider. So it doesn't really make a lot of sense to keep going to council on every fee and charge that we have in the business.
So effectively, the portfolio holder would be the representative of the executive taking part in that discussion. in
Yes,
setting
it's the
charge.
expectation, yes, because we are a political organisation, and anything to do with fees and charges potentially could have some elements of politics you would have to think about and be minded to.
So, but I think the problem with that, thinking politically, I mean, isn't often, in a lot of the cases all the time, the council is a monopoly supplier. It's not in the market where you quoted a company where pricing, obviously they've got competitors and you have to manoeuvre. But that's not me. There's no competition on car parks. I mean, we have the car parks. I mean, and so that we're not giving the option to the residents to go somewhere else. So
That's
So
what I'm
these things-
saying. I singled out car parking.
no,
It's just-
but I mean, other things where we are pretty well monopoly, and those things tend to be difficult to decide politically. Never mind
Yeah.
change from day to day. But
So our big income stream, such as building control, is market sensitive, and
that one is one. Yes,
it is, and it's also commercially sensitive. And that's £500,000 worth of revenue to us a year. But or £500,000 plus when we get it sorted out and going in, because the market's difficult at the moment. And we are competing with AI as approved inspectors. So we're publishing our fees and charges, they don't. So we're already on the back foot as far as building control is concerned.
I think the case can be better, more easily made where there is competition,
Yes.
and we're not just
Yeah.
picking the pockets of the residents. And the question is by how much we pick the pockets there.
No, so, Chairman, I agree. And so the other area could be sort of licensing, for example, where we're a monopoly. I think so. Out of the sort of 30 odd pages of fees and charges, there are a couple of areas that are standout where we expected members to say, "Hold on a sec, a full delegation is possibly a step too far without any kind of conditions around that." Car park was one actually, but a lot of the other things we do are either in competition or the buyer has an option. So play pitch hire, things like that, and care line charges. I mean, we're in a market there. They're not compulsory things that people have to have. They're things that lots of people like and want and prepared to pay for. So I suppose, as Peter said, we've gone from one extreme to the other to test where members' appetite is for streamlining the process and giving the agility to the business to set those charges. And if there are a couple of areas that members want to make as an exception, that's absolutely fine. And I think that will presumably be wrapped up in the notes of this meeting.
Well, Peter, for example, I would like you suggesting, Graham, licensing should be with the licensing committee. In fact, they've got a review going through right at this moment to set the charges for the future. And I wouldn't really like to see the 151 officer overriding that.
Just a thought, if it is just to speed up the process, rather than take it to the full council, surely it would be with the approval of the portfolio holder for that particular area. I mean, it would not be the 151 officer, it would be the 151 officer plus the portfolio holder. That would still speed it up.
That's absolutely fine. So often we'd say the so-and-so officer in consultation with the portfolio holder. That's how the delegate, because actually portfolio holders don't have any individual decision-making authority, whereas officers can have that delegated to them by the council.
Yeah, but if
So you
they
can
felt
add
it
that
was
in.
wrong, they could take it to full executive and say,
Yes,
hang on a bit.
absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
So you can make that explicit in
Yeah.
the approval,
Yeah.
and then that's an essential part of the process. So I couldn't do it in isolation without
Yeah.
consulting the portfolio holder, that's right. And if the portfolio holder said, No, I don't like what your proposal is. I want this to go to Executive and Council for a full debate, regardless of the need for speed. Let's do that. Then that introduces that double check. Yep.
Can we introduce those words into this section then, along those lines?
Something like that. It would be in discussion with the portfolio holder, and then if they felt it was not the right thing to do, apart from anything else, it would take one person who might be putting up car park charges, the 151 officer, out of the firing line, because people don't like it anyway.
I appreciate your concern, thank you.
Okay, so Peter, can we put some words like that into this section then, into this item?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Because the last one on that is just a clarification of the definition of financial systems. Came out of an internal audit that we should be a bit clearer on what our financial system is. And this will please Gail know when to put this in. So I'm always aiming to please Gail to get good audit reports. Thank you, Gail. So that's pretty much it, really. Yeah.
We go through the contract procurement rules section. Is that something that you're going to cover now? Or?
That's what Patrick did. And
No, but this section, we've already got, we did all those parts of it, but the actual document itself.
It was there for context, so I've highlighted 3 changes to it.
Yeah, I had 1 or 2 comments on this.
Oh, yeah, you're welcome to, yeah, sure.
Section 14.2. It's to do with the assessment of potential suppliers, and you limit it to financial assessment. Do you do any, is it worth doing management assessment as well? I'm thinking of, just through experience really, using a building contractor, which I didn't do a company search on to find if there's been previous companies have gone bankrupt.
Okay.
So there would be people that you perhaps wouldn't choose to take on as to work for the council. But this only covers financial. Should there be something broader in there to include some background checks on previous directorships or previous business interests?
It's 14.3, isn't it?
Well, yes.
Unfortunately, Chairman, we've lost Patrick now, because I think Patrick thought we'd come to the end of the item. So no, that's okay. I mean, I think Patrick could probably point you straight to somewhere, or say, yes, we need to cover that, or yes, we do that. So apologies.
It depends how you read the words there. So 14.3 looks at some many elements there.
Yeah, we don't need
14.3. Yeah, okay.
And that's a fact. We would consider doing it.
So we can be a bit more explicit in the contract procedure rules.
It's a suggestion. Just
Yeah, no,
that's
that's absolutely fine. So I think, so can I just check, Chairman? So on 14.3, I think that's where Councillor C, what did you say? It's in there
I think
at the moment.
covers a lot of it, isn't it?
So, oh right, okay.
I don't think of anything else.
So that's if a contractor's expressed interest in being in a standing list of suppliers. So I think it's got a slightly different meaning. I think what you're suggesting, Chairman, is that we use pretty much those items in the section that talks about evaluation of a contractor in our due diligence bit, which is slightly different from this.
Yes. Yeah.
But again, we could cross-reference back to those issues listed in 14.3 alongside the financial criteria on the evaluation later on, maybe, as they're already listed in here. Because hopefully that would pick up the concerns around the directors.
We should actually pick up the financial assessment.
Yeah.
Just be explicit about it.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to do a company search to find out. I suppose you do that anyway.
We do.
We do, yeah.
And we can be explicit about it.
Okay.
So what tends to happen in practice is that the spending officers don't do these checks. Patrick does them. So, but that's not to say that we shouldn't have a full set of documents here to document what we do. So any other concerns like that we'll take on board. That's a good point.
I picked up just one typo basically, the 15.4, I assume CPR 10 should be CPR 14.
Okay, well yeah, we'll definitely double check that one, thank you. Did you catch that, Emma? Is that right? Thank you. We'll get Patrick to look at that. So the numbers moved on.
Okay, so item 7 then, complete. We have a recommendation. Is this also subject to these minor amendments we've discussed?
Yes, certainly.
Recommended that committee recommends the update to the financial regulations and any consequential changes to the scheme of delegation to the council for adoption. Are we all agreed on this? Agreed. Thank you. Item 8, tax strategy update. Again, Peter, would you take us
Thank you,
through
Chair. Fairly quick item really. We have to comply with HMRC regulations, which now require us since 2017 to produce a tax strategy. And effectively how we deal with tax in this council in the local authority environment. The strategy is really more aimed at the wider corporate world, which do a lot of tax avoidance, not necessarily tax evasion, it's a thin line. And have much more complex tax structures than we do. As a local authority, we're fairly straightforward in the tax that we deal. We've touched on some of it tonight in terms of the CIS, we have VAT, PAYE, the usual, we pay stamp duty on property transactions. We don't have any particular complex tax structures as such, but we still set out a declaration of how we intend to handle tax and our governance around that. And this is what this document really does. The reason we brought it along tonight is because we have a responsibility to make sure that it remains current and that it's noted that it has been reviewed. So this is a process of bringing it to. We originally were bringing it. We had it down as a 1-year review. But realistically, our tax structures don't change that much really. So we're proposing really to bring it, I think it's only 2 years in the document now. I'm sure it says 2 years now. 2 years.
Or sooner if something material changes.
Yeah. So that's pretty much it. I'm quite happy to talk about the document if you wish to explore it.
Just one very simple question. Looking back to the last issue of it in September 2018, am I correct that the only change is actually in the last paragraph? Or the other things that I missed?
What I think the main report.
Well, the previous tax strategy from 2018, I quickly scanned backwards and forwards, and all I can see is a change in section 8.1.
Oh, it's about the 2 years, yes,
Yeah.
it literally is the only change. Yes,
Okay, so
that's what I was referring to.
It's tried and tested, and you've hardly
Yes,
tinkered with it at all. So.
It's identical apart from
Yeah, we formally review this through our treasury management tax board that we have, which is myself, Graham, and the key accountants.
Any other comments, questions? Okay, then we have the recommendation that the audit committee considers the attached tax strategy and our observations to the executive. Okay. Item 9, annual governance statement. Consideration of potential governance issues. Again, Peter.
So Chairman, once a year the audit committee are asked to approve the I recommend for approval the annual governance statement, which sits alongside our financial statements. We have to publish them at the same time every year. The governance statement goes through all the governance arrangements that are in place, all the checks and balances that we have around the way business is conducted at authority and the integrity with which we work to. That's a short form really what the governance statement does. So it's a live document really. It's not something we just come to once a year. It's something we should work on all year round. So the reason, and that's the reason why it's now on every auditor or every audit committee agenda. It's just a verbal consideration of between the members on the committee of any potential issues that may be considered to be of a governance nature. So you've got a document here under agenda item 9, which is just a bit of a scheme as to test out any and prompts as well as to what might be considered governance issues. Now, I'm not saying you have to bring anything to the table. It's just an opportunity for members of the audit committee to flag anything up that you feel may be something you've heard or something you've come across over the last quarter or so in the time of being in office, and you just want to bring it to the attention of the audit committee, and we test it out against this criteria. So, okay, it's something you might want to progress as a review to see what's going on there, or maybe say pass it over to an Audit and Scrutiny Committee to look into further if you feel it's not a governance issue but it's maybe an operational issue, or maybe just things you say, okay, it's just ongoing with business but you feel governance is fine on it. So but it's just a live review of where we're at to make sure our governance is sound.
So
it's just open to members really.
This is brought to the committee once a year, every year, just
The governance statement is, but this conversation is something we should have at every meeting. If it's only just literally a couple of minutes, just an opportunity for the members of the committee to flag up anything they think potentially might be governance issues, so we can note them, because that all feeds into the governance statement at the year end, and it demonstrates then to the organisation, to everyone else, that governance is being considered actively within the authority. It's not something we just do at the year end as a tick box exercise.
Okay. And you note in this that they're still looking for the recruitment of the in-house vacancy. I suppose you'll cover that in your report, Carol.
Yes.
Okay.
So if officers haven't got anything, Chair, we can move on. No, sorry, Glenn was that.
So, again, a recommendation. The committee is invited to raise any potential emerging governance issues for consideration. And I think that is the only one at the moment. Gail, is it your area with the vacancy?
Well, I wouldn't really class it as a major governance issue for the end governance statement, because obviously the resources that were required we can procure them from elsewhere.
Okay. Okay. So why do you need to put this in the introduction of this the internal audit plan? That's not part of this. Sorry, I'm looking on this paper.
Oh.
Yeah, sorry, everyone. Okay. So that recommendation, have we all agreed on that?
Agreed.
Item 10, Peter again, debt recovery update.
Thank you, Chairman. So back in February this year, seems long ago now, Council adopted an income and debt management policy, which is the overarching framework within which we manage all of our income streams into the authority. It was a significant rewrite of something that's quite historic, really, as a document. And the driver for the rewrite was just that the world and our systems and our clientele have moved on over a period of time. And we just needed to catch up in our methodologies of managing debt and classifying what should be debt and what really shouldn't be going on the balance sheet. So the gist of the income and debt policy was that we should be charging for services at the point of service wherever possible, with the exceptions of things like rent, council tax, where there's statutory provision for people to pay on a monthly basis. But the smaller one-off values, like say a green waste bin, garden waste, it's £60 and they should just pay that there and then and not be putting it on the balance sheet for collection at a later date. Charging for memorial hall use or borough hall, for the small clubs and that. We tended in the past to invoice them rather than do that. We should just be collecting the money through card payment and PDQ machines at that point. So, so that's the thrust of the debt management policy. So I'll just read through my notes here. So I suppose there's three key areas. We've enhanced our IT processes, and we're kind of coming to the end of that program now, where we've updated Aggresso, which is our key management system, financial management system, to handle direct debits in a much more efficient way. And we built that into Careline, the Careline service, recently as a pilot, where Careline was using 3 different databases to manage its client base, with a paper chase to collect the money through Aggresso, through our debtors function, which was incredibly laborious, really, and it wasn't that efficient in managing the service. So we've built the whole process into Aggresso, so it's all managed in one place, and that's a model now that is available wherever we choose to take direct debit in that way and handle it through Aggresso. And we've also, we're in the process of just bringing on board a new updated version of our Adelante cash handling system, which sits outside of Aggresso, but it collects all the money from all the different sources before it enters into the financial systems. And Adelante has new functionality in it that allows us to set up recurring payments for the smaller payments, like the £60 and the £65 garden waste, where we set it up once and then the whole thing becomes automated. We don't need officers to interact with that until at any point, if somebody wants to cancel it, they can cancel it electronically. It just brings that much more efficiency into the process. It means also that if we're dealing with a client on the phone, we can ping them a link instantly. Just you get an email or phone number, just ping them a link to pay, as you would with many other organisations like magazine subscriptions, and you can just deal with it there and then. And we're not collecting any financial information from them; it's all done remotely. So we're not breaching our own IT requirements that we have to comply with around handling people's bank details. So that's sitting within the implementation of the income and debt management policy. The second key piece of work that's been going on this year is we've been going around each service. We haven't treated, whilst the policy is very clear about the organisation's expectations of how we handle debt, how we create debt and how we collect it afterwards. We don't necessarily use that as a blanket policy. That's the overarching ethos, that this is our expectation. It sits within the finance regs. But we do not treat every single service the same, because we have different types of clientele, such as vulnerable people. So where we have vulnerable people or people that are of limited means, we take a sympathetic approach, but a business-like approach, a firm approach in terms of what our expectations are of recovering that money. So we've been going round service by service and setting out the processes and procedures within each of those teams that will comply with our debt management policy, but also mean it's efficient for them, and that we're not hanging around in terms of charging where we should be charging and collecting that money on an appropriate basis. And the third piece of work that's been underway since February is we've been reconfiguring our exchequer team, which is the people within the finance team that handle the financial transactions, to make sure we've got the right capacity in those teams to handle any of the debt management that we do. So the structure going forward now is that the finance team manage debt from the point of view of letting the services know on a monthly basis what's due for collection from them, and prompting them to go in and make those collections happen. The services have the responsibility, wherever they're charging for debt onto the balance sheet, they have the responsibility to make sure that debt's collected up to the point of where they feel they can't, within the policies we've agreed for each service, where they can't pursue that any further. And then it comes back to the central accountancy team for us to take a decision on how we'll then proceed to collect that debt, which is a much more efficient and a structured way of moving things forward without every service just doing their own thing in terms of how they feel it's right. So we've got a much more governance focused process sitting across all of our corporate debt. We've also increased our debt handling capacity within the revenues team, that's council tax and business rates. We did a major revamp of that team, which we finished in August time. Completely restructured the team. We put an extra debt recovery officer into that area because it's such a significant and important area for us. We feel that potentially it's an area that can be coming under pressure in the next few years. We're certainly feeling it a little bit now, that people are feeling a little bit, we're just noticing it, that there's a little bit of pressure coming through, and what we're wanting to do is make sure that we are preventing debts going to the bailiffs wherever possible. So we're not necessarily, we want to be much more proactive by having the capacity to ensure we're working with debtors much sooner upstream, so that we're preventing any court cases being presented to the magistrates to get debt orders to recover. The other area of significance to us is the housing benefit overpayment. And it's a very specialist area of recovery. It's coming under a little bit of pressure because of universal credit. It's something that we need to properly resource with specialist officers that are dedicated to doing that. And we've contracted with Reigate a month ago now to Reigate and Banstead, who have a specialist team that deal with many of the Surrey authorities on the same issue of dedicated to recovering housing benefit overpayment. I suppose the underlying issue with housing benefit overpayment is that with universal credit coming along, as it is creeping in, any claimants that owe us money that go over to universal credit, it's much harder to recover from, because we have to work with the DWP to secure the money from the payments that universal credit are making. So really, we're having to really ramp up our resource there to make sure that we are robustly getting what we can as soon as we can. So that's just kind of an overview really of the work that's been going on since we launched the new policy.
Thank you. Do you think historically, from a historical perspective, that you've now improved the debt recovery position compared to some years back? Is it an improving situation? Maybe next year, with these problems you just mentioned, might go the other way perhaps, but...
Yes, it wasn't particularly broken as such. It was just needing to be moved forward more than anything. It wasn't. I'm not saying that there were horrendous problems sitting there with the debt. There weren't. The debt was being collected. It's just that we are facing this really tough challenge going forward, and we've got to make every pound count, and we've got to be using our IT systems and our staff a lot more effectively in how we handle financial transactions. So a big part of this policy really is to enable services to pull back on their staff doing financial transactions and do more frontline service delivery, where at the moment the balance is that there's a lot of admin staff in the frontline services actually doing stuff that effectively we should just be getting the IT to do it for them. So it's just moving that whole balance forward, and allowing us really to reshape our capacity within the teams, and also to make efficiency savings.
Yes, thank you. Any comments, questions?
Quick question for Gail, if I may. This sounds really good. I tend to get a little bit nervous when the computers are doing a lot of the work, when you're interfacing particularly with Careline people. Is there any plan next year to start looking at maybe aspects of this from the internal audit perspective, taking one or two items up and seeing how effectively they are working now that they're becoming embedded?
Yes, well, we'd be taking into account when I do my risk assessment, when I'm carrying out the, doing assessment for the audit plan for next year. And also that's one of the things that will be taken into consideration is where there has been changes regarding key systems, and which obviously this is one of those.
And Chairman, it's a good question because we would expect Gail's audit plan to always include an element of checking some of our income. We collect over £170 million of income over a year, which is an awful lot of money, and that comes through in an awful lot of small transactions from a lot of customers, and so lots and lots of moving parts, and we are reliant on our IT, and in fact some of our lowest value IT systems do most of the processing, so our BACS processing work motors through hundreds of thousands of transactions in and out of customer accounts every year, and this Adelante system that handles the whole thing, I mean, I think it costs us £10 a year, but it's right at the heart of all of these transactions. And so it's the importance of the system that drives our risk profile rather than our annual maintenance payment. And so yes, we absolutely want Gail to be spotting any particular risk, particularly on the upgrader system, and we just upgraded our back system. So yeah.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, Peter. Gail, progress on the internal audit plan for 2019-20.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you can see here, we have the progress plan. In the introduction, I've painted as the Chairman mentioned earlier, the vacancy that we had out for there. What I can confirm, unfortunately, we're unsuccessful. So we're reassessing what we do and how we do it. But I think until the end of the year, we'll be relying on myself and the contractor to complete the audit plan as presented to the audit committee. As you can see, there are some changes that have been made. If I can just apologise for page 94, I've left in paragraph contents, paragraph 5, executive summary limited shows no assurance opinions. As there wasn't any, I haven't taken that out, so I do apologise. And if we go down to page 100, actually 99 is probably the best one, we can actually see the reviews that have been completed, where the reports are actually physically being issued. And on page 101, it gives the progress of each of the reviews, including those marked with asterisks, where I've indicated where it's got one asterisk. That's where those that have been provided to the Southern Internal Audit Partnership at the start of the financial year, and those that have two asterisks are those that have been provided to them since after that period. So what I have had to do, I've had to reassess the plan, and down on page 106, you can see the reviews that at the moment I have deferred from this year and deferring them on to 2020-21. But what you can also see there on page 106 is actually the reviews that are actually being carried in to the original plan. And basically the change there is about 17 days that 17 days, 12 days that we're short on. Considering the amount of days that we have and also the resourcing difficulties we would have due to the vacancy, I feel that we'll still be providing sufficient coverage to give management assurance that our controls are working in these particular areas.
In terms of the frequency of the plan, frequency of the internal audits, is there any leeway, any movement there? I mean, when we're talking about saving costs, can you move, say, a 1 year rolling audit to a 2 year?
Yeah, well, previously, shall we say, days gone by, it used to be more prescribed as to what external audit would suggest to internal audit as to how frequently we should do particular reviews. Now, because external audit do a lot more a lot more work on their own side to give them assurance, although it doesn't go into the depth that an internal audit does. I haven't, or generally most people don't know, we actually spread it a lot more than what we would have previously under what was classed as managed audit by external audit. So now our assessment that the assessment that I carry out is what we are doing as Waverley and what I feel is in place regarding the controls, what weaknesses I feel there may be, taking on what we talked about a moment ago about changing systems, and I would then build that into my assessment, which I can also share with you as an new audit chairman. You can come along and have a look at my methodology. Previous audit committee, Councillor Seaborn will confirm I've had a look at my methodology.
Old friends.
And again, as I say, I'm quite open as to the methodology I use, but more importantly, some of that does come down to my own judgment, because I know what is going on in the council. That's part of my role, to be aware of what's happening, what changes there are, and how I feel that would affect us as Waverley. And therefore that's what, how I come up with, or partially how I come up with my reviews to be completed. But taking your answer to your question, there is no prescribed frequency as to when the audit has to be done. It comes down to the judgment as to the risks that we may be open to.
Okay, thank you. Any questions to get on?
I'd just like to express concern that we are still under-resourced inside internal audit, which has an impact on our completion dates for the plan for this year, which then has a knock-on effect, I suspect, into next year, and any ambitions we might have to add to the future internal audit requirements. Is there any way which, well, there must be some ways, but probably cost will be an impediment. But I really do feel that we need to feel comfortable as an audit team that we have a fully resourced and adequate internal audit team in place, the absence of which I think there is a bit of a gap.
I think maybe the committee have to take into consideration that in prior years we've only had myself and the contractor. So in effect, this particular situation we're in, we've actually had to just revert back to where we were last year before we went down the recruitment process. And unfortunately that wasn't successful. But that's why I'm trying to convey to the committee the fact from the number of days that I'm moving to next year and the number of days that have already been added in, it's a shortfall in effect of 12 days. So that's why I'm confident that I'm able to provide management with the assurance that and the audit committee that we will be able to meet the needs.
The audit process is with you, isn't it, Gail? You are the person who does the internal audit.
Yes.
And if you were away for any reason, illness or whatever, there is a risk that this could be completed or not completed.
I'd like to think that, our business continuity on that would be that actually the contractor who already provide the same management level to quite a few of the other Surrey authorities already could in actual fact step in if required.
Okay.
And they would obviously then have a close liaison with the Section 151 officer. But fundamentally any decision regarding that would obviously be the Section 151 officer's responsibility, as he is the person that's responsible for ensuring we have an effective internal audit service.
So they could step in at short notice if they needed to.
Yes.
Yeah. So Chairman, what I can do is reassure the committee that despite the sort of financial picture of the council, there are no proposals to reduce the budget for internal audit. I think the issue here is that we were hoping to get some more flexibility from having an in-house resource to support Gail, and we failed twice now to secure the appropriate resource. But we will have the same number of audit days in the overall resource, albeit coming from a contractor plus Gale now, rather than Gale, a contractor, and another member of staff. And so hopefully this is a sort of a temporary blip given our issues recruiting, and the scale that will sort of re-establish the old way of delivery, which is Gale plus contractor. But overall, the number of audit days that we will be able to utilise should be the same as it has been, and there are no proposals to reduce that or the budget that goes along with that. And the other sort of Surrey district and borough councils, you know, provide in varying ways. A couple of them have an internal audit team. Some of them don't have a Gale. They just have a sorry to refer to you as a Gale, but they just use a contractor. Some use a partnership amongst Surrey authorities. Some use Surrey Council. So a whole number of. I think the key concern for the committee would be. Is the number of days of audit time that we have adequate, and it certainly has been in the past, then are you satisfied that they're being deployed appropriately to address the risks that are thrown up in the audit plan? And that's why Gale brings you a report every meeting, so that you can either take some assurance from that or raise concerns.
Okay, thank you. On recommendation.
Sorry, Chair. Looking through the reports that have been completed, most of the opinions are adequate. One that leaps out at me is the asbestos being limited. Do we have a follow-up process with an internal audit where something comes across as not, being well short of where we think it ought to be in a particular year? It's great to see that officers have already gone and addressed most of the issues. Will there be follow-up to go back and revisit that to make sure that the assurance that the recommendations have actually been carried out to a satisfactory level? Because I'm exceedingly nervous about asbestos, not least because it appears in probably our housing and I've got some say.
Yeah. What I can confirm, yes, there is a follow-up process, but the other, as part of the finalisation of the report and the recommendation being implemented, the head of service actually inputs the evidence that supports the implementation of the recommendation, and so therefore I do go in and do a follow-up and make sure that basically particularly those high-risk areas such as asbestos, Legionella, and again I know that even in housing, the action plans themselves to follow up again to make sure that those have been embedded in the new control that's going in.
Brilliant, thank you. That's a good answer, thank you.
And what I would maybe like to point out as well as an example of a follow-up, maybe not, page 102, as you can see halfway down there, obviously I have one up for air quality, looking at the processes that we've now got in place, that they are now embedded, that they're now being followed, and that's the issue. As an example.
Thanks.
Okay, we have a recommendation. It is recommended that the committee considers the information contained in Annex 1 and following discussion at the audit committee meeting identifies any action it wishes to be taken, which we have done. Has the committee agreed?
Agreed.
Item 13, Gail, again, fraud investigations.
Should be outstanding recommendations first.
Item 12, Chairman.
Item 12.
I missed that.
Agreed, fine.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, this is the outstanding recommendation, and members would have noted on the previous report that there was only one recommendation that hadn't yet been implemented and was overdue. The recommendation is actually on item 12, and that relates to a paper that you've already had at this evening's committee on financial regulations.
Are you trying to say we've turned your red dot into a green
Yes, as you previously approved it, the answer to that is yes.
Excellent.
And just another point on page 109, there is a comment there regarding the previous recommendation that came to the September Audit Committee. They have now been implemented because members were concerned. That was relating to flexi time. Yeah. And there was one on WTS green contracts.
Okay, thank you.
I was moving on to the next one, so.
I mean, we have to do another recommendation, don't we? Which I think is the one I just read out, so.
We are.
Thank you, Chairman.
No, yes, item 13, fraud investigation.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, this is our fraud investigation summary up until the end of the second quarter. I think the covering paper obviously gives an overview of the work that has been done, and in Annex 1, in tabular form, provides the output of what's been achieved up to the 30th of September.
Are there any special points we'd like to point out, or is there
No, really. As I say, we continue to work hard, to make sure that those people that we have in our council housing are the rightful people to be there, to enable those that are less fortunate that haven't got roofs over their head.
Great job. Okay, thank you. Recommendation.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Item 14. Audit Committee, the current annual work programme. So, any comments from the committee on the work programme?
Just something to note, Chairman, if there's anything you think is missing, but I think it's as per your normal routine workload for the year as a committee, and there will no doubt be extra things to respond to, react to as the year goes on, but this is the base, the core items.
Everybody okay? Yeah. Yes, right. Invited to note the correct annual work programme, which we have done. No exempt issues. Can I introduce this on any other business item?
Your meeting, Chairman.
Well, only a comment that Jerome and I went on the course on Monday.
Oh, yeah.
Which was the 4th Local Audit Quality Forum, which I found, and I think Jerome did, was extremely interesting, very high quality, and some very good presentations, which I think I mentioned earlier, Graham, that
Yes.
I would like to think we could invite one or both of the key speakers to come and present similar material, if not the same material, to ourselves, as a bit of a training exercise. But it highlighted a lot of the issues that the council is engaged in, and one of them was to do with, for example, investment in commercial property, and what issues the audit committee had to be aware of, things of this sort.
Good.
The meeting itself was chaired by the chair of the Public Sector Audit Appointments Board, so it was quite a high quality team there. But just some main points, bullet points, very brief about with this. There was a lot of, well, there was a mixture of the delegates there. There were council officers as well as members, councillors, as well as other units or outfits that had this interest in audit, the audit quality. One of the main issues that came from the floor was that there was a lot of concern about not meeting the July deadline for completing the audit.
Yep.
And that was largely, I think, well, it's mostly to do with smaller councils, but they all mentioned the same problem, this lack of resources, lack of staffing, both on the council staff and the auditing staff, because that time of year apparently is quite heavy on the audit, the external audit activities. So I think you should have a clap on the back for producing our audit by the end of July, given the circumstances.
Peter and the team.
I'll take it back to
Anyway, that one thing that did come out from one council, which was Torridge, I think it's North Devon, they have Grant Thornton as their external auditor, and they've deemed their fees to be unacceptable for various reasons.
Interesting.
And it's created some discussion, and the LGA group that hosted our session said they obviously would and could provide a dispute resolution service if there was any issue. Now I don't know whether, with our issue you had, Graham, with the fees, has that been resolved?
I haven't paid them yet.
No, but
I'm not sure what that means. It's been resolved.
anyway, no, it was just
So the answer is it hasn't been resolved, and so I wrote to the PSAA that you referred to, who are the body that administer the tendering of all the audit fees, and they've written back, and it's sort of just sat there at the moment. But and I'm sure Grant Thornton will press it at some point. It's a matter of principle rather than money. I mean, they're chasing down a few grand, but I wasn't happy with that. I don't think the committee were either. So.
But it was interesting that that came to light. There's another Grant Thornton issue.
Yes.
You're probably aware also that there's a new audit code that's going to be issued next year, subject to government approval, and that will then apply from 220 through to 221. And they say that will increase the auditing workload with a larger emphasis on value for money, which the external auditor will take a bigger part of. Further work may be needed on the cloud judgment. That could lead to increased costs.
Yep.
That's basically it, the main bullet points.
Okay, thank you for the feedback.
So yes, I mean, I'd recommend, as we just said, I said a bit earlier, about getting one or two of these guys down to do a presentation here, if that's possible.
Do you want to drop me an email, Chairman, at some point, and just perhaps the ones that you think are most relevant and the best speakers that you saw, and we'll try and tap them up.
So we can do that.
Yeah, that'd be great. No problem.
That was it.
Chair, can I just add to that? It might be worth the Value for Money ONS members to come along if we do get a talk, because certainly over the last few years there's sometimes been a bit of confusion over who does what.
Yeah.
That'd be useful.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Chairman. If you go.